Greetings to you. We come today to the second half of Hebrews chapter 11. That is Hebrews 11, verses 23 to 40. I've decided to split this chapter into two for my talks because there is so much here uh, that is the whole message of Hebrews and indeed the whole message of the gospel, though I know I said that about chapter 10 as well. But there are some remarkable things here that turn the world's wisdom on its head and sometimes turn our own thinking on its head as well, and show in a remarkable way something you pick up in occasional hymns and in good theology, that actually the state of the redeemed is even better, is going to be even better than the state of Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall. It's a big, big theme, and it raises lots and lots of big theological questions, which we're not going into now, not at all. But it is part of what Hebrews is saying, that in salvation, God does something so remarkable. He makes it better than it was before it went wrong, before human beings, Genesis, Adam and Eve, rebelled against God, something even better than they had. And so back to the first part, there was a lot to say last time, and I held this tiny bit over to this time. In verse 16, as it is of chapter 11, as it is, they desire a better homeland, that is a heavenly one. These are the ancients of faith, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. They they were looking not just for God's promise of a land, but for something even better. They knew that where they were wasn't where God had actually for all time called them to be. They were living in tents, they were living as uh, nomads in some sort, herdsmen, great herds, and so on, but still living in tents. It was their homeland, but it wasn't. They desire a better homeland, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, He has prepared a city for them. The homeland they knew was the world of agriculture. It was rural. It was living in groups of families with servants and very large numbers of animals. It was a farming community, but it wasn't a city. The community was family and those who worked for them. It wasn't the whole wider gathering of people which makes up a city. Now, for uh, some of us, certainly rural might sound better than urban, but we're used to damaged, broken urban. The Bible begins with a garden and ends with a city. And that is part of God's blessing because He calls us into community, into fellowship with many different people, people of different backgrounds and so on, but into a perfect community that's working well. In the city, there's a river and trees and every good thing to eat and so on. That's the latter part of Revelation. We're not going there today either. But notice that God's salvation improves on the original creation, which was of a garden where people largely were in isolation, small family groups. In the city, assuming it's done right and it hasn't gone wrong like many of our human urban gatherings, the city is God's ultimate destination for his people, where people live together in fellowship, in peace, in harmony with God. That's a blessing we have yet to discover in full. Though, again, this chapter, this second half of the chapter will hint at it. Well, last time we had uh, the whole community of God, starting with Cain and Abel and Noah and Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all showing faith, or uh, in Cain's faith, lack of faith, but faith in God. And it was that faith that motivated them to look for something better, for a better future, not to be content with this world or what they would find here, not to think that would ultimately satisfy, not to be content with a land or a farm or a family, but always to seek something better and to know that God's promises were for something bigger and better than they could even envisage, bigger and better than they could see. Because faith, verse 1, is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, not being satisfied with what we can see because we know that God's will for us is something even better, something we can't see. And so the story continues in verse 23. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth because they saw the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. This not being afraid comes up a number of times in the next few verses. Of course, in one sense, they were afraid of the king's edict. That's why Moses' mother hid him, afraid that he would be killed, but ultimately willing to go against the king and believe something better could and would happen. And then 24, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He's shortening the story and giving us one slant on it to make a very strong point that Moses chose to be part of the subjected people, which were his background in one sense, rather than to be part of the oppressing, conquering people, which was also part of his background by adoption. He chose to be part of the people of God who were suffering rather than to be a part of Egypt and a big important part of Egypt who were oppressing. Uh, Believing the point of this is because he had faith that there could be better, there would be better, that those who were oppressed wouldn't always be oppressed, and that there was future in it. So, verse 26, Hebrews boldly says he considers abuse suffered for the Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. Same mindset. What's here on earth, what I can see here and now, there's something better ahead. And it's better to be part of the oppressed people who are the people of God than to be part of the oppressors who have their own gods and don't worship the true God. He was looking ahead to the reward, not to the earnings, but to God's gift, which he believed was there somewhere by faith, not by sight. By faith he left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered as though he saw him who is invisible. Now, of course, he was afraid of the king's anger. That's partly why he fled Egypt initially and went to live in Midian, where he saw the burning bush and where he married and all the rest. But he comes back to Egypt, called back by God, and challenges the king. Clearly, humanly speaking, afraid of the king's anger, but buoyed up by something stronger, which is faith in what God could do, even though he couldn't see it. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Egypt. When he told them about the Passover and putting the blood on the doorposts and on the lintels, he didn't know what the outcome would be. He didn't know at that point that the angel of death would come over and that the firstborn would die in each home in Egypt unless that blood was there symbolically protecting them. He didn't understand yet about the blood that protects us from God's wrath. But he believed that by applying the blood, something better would happen. Faith is what you can't see, and trusting in it. Then moving on, 29, by faith the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were dry land. When the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. It's following Moses, following God, crossing the sea with that great miracle, and a wall of water either side of them as it's described, and they walked through the middle of it by faith, believing that that would be okay. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell. Funny to think of the walls of Jericho having faith. Well, they didn't clearly. But it was the people's faith, believing this strange command given through Joshua, march around the city for 7 days and the walls will fall. But not seeing, not knowing how marching around the city could make a scrap of difference, but doing it because God told them to, and they, or at least their believers, or enough of them, their leaders, or enough of them, believed that obeying God would lead to an astonishing outcome that they couldn't have seen or imagined. But there it was. By faith, Rahab the prostitute didn't perish with those who were disobedient because she received the spies in peace. If you go back to the story of Rahab uh, back in the book of Joshua, she believed that God's people would prevail and that God would prevail, and that her city of Jericho would fall to the people of God. She believed that, and we're told she believed it. And therefore, she is spared, she and her family, believing what doesn't seem likely. Uh, Jericho, an ancient city, a strong city with great city walls. The archaeology is still going on. There are still digs around ancient Jericho, and there'd been walls there and a city for a very long time, for at least 11,000 years, according to today's archaeologists. So it was at least 8,500 years, 7,500. Get my maths, attempting to get my maths right. 7,500 years prior to Joshua, that city had been there. And the Israelites at that time were a ragbag who'd been wandering in the desert for 40 years, didn't really know what they were doing. They weren't an organized military force or anything like that. But Rahab believed that God's people would conquer, that God would conquer. Faith. Now he's told some stories, and a bit more detail he's going to tell, uh, to name six more briefly, and you're meant to know the stories for yourselves. And an educated Jew of the days of Hebrews, or those who knew their Old Testament, among the early, maybe non-Jewish Christians, would have got these names. What more shall I say? Verse 32, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel. They're deliberately in pairs, and the better known stories associate with the first one of each pair, Gideon and Samson and David. But through faith, they did. Got a list of 9 things in 3 threes. Sorry about that. It's not just me making this up, it's there in the passage. we'll see that. What did between them Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets do? Through faith, that is by believing in God's promise, believing there was something better to reach out for and to look to. They conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises. That's to do with both military and political power. They subdued, they organized, they got kingdoms and the world and politics going right and healthily. Promises have, were made and kept. Astonishing. Politics that worked, justice and administration that worked. They achieved good stuff in ruling and in organizing the people and the world in their time. They were effective, successful military, political, administrative leaders. And then the second bunch of three is sort of about overcoming death. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Death is the big enemy, the last enemy, says St. Paul. Death is what ends every career completely. But somehow they resisted death. These men of faith, the ancients, the prophets, in different ways. And we can recall the stories if we know our Bibles well enough. Shutting the mouths of lions. Well, assorted people came across lions of those named, particularly Samson and David. But looking at the prophets, Daniel comes to mind rather a lot. The mouths of lions were shut. They quenched the power of fire. Well, Daniel's three friends, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, thrown into the burning fiery furnace, and one like a son of God appears there, and they come out unscathed, even though it was so hot that the soldiers who threw them in were burnt to death. Something very remarkable going on by faith, because they believed, because they refused to compromise. Our God will save us, but if not, we will go into that furnace because we know our God will save us, and their God did save them. They believed, faith by faith, and also escaping the edge of the sword. So many instances of God's people being saved from, as it were, the edge of the sword in the Old Testament. Uh, Attempts at assassination of David, not least. Gideon fighting a much, much more powerful army, and indeed sending most of his soldiers home so it could be seen that victory over the Midianites was God's victory, with David's 300 men against the thousands of Gideon's 300 men against the thousands of well-trained Midianite soldiers. They conquered death. They believed in God's promise, God's power, and they were even able to conquer death in that sense of escaping what would be seen as inevitable death. And you find the same with some of the other prophets on other occasions, the attempts to kill Jeremiah, for example, and plenty more. But then the third set of three things that is achieved by faith in this remarkable list. They were made strong out of weakness. They became mighty in war. They put foreign armies to flight. You could find different places where this becomes true in the Old Testament. And I think very particularly in what we call the Apocrypha, that is the books, particularly the history books that describe things between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. And in particular, the books of the Maccabees, which talk about Israel's rebellion against the utterly cruel and monstrous reign of Antiochus the fourth Antiochus Epiphanes, part of the ancestry, the great empire that Alexander the Great had built up, that splits into two, but part of that continues to rule this part of the world, and very much under Antiochus Epiphanes, who's reigning around 160 BC. They oppressed the Israelites most severely and cruelly. And there are all sorts of stories in the books of Maccabees, not the Bible, but part of the history of the time, particularly in 2 Maccabees, of the resistance of these Maccabees brothers, Judas Maccabeus, as Handel would have us call him, and his brothers, and the others who fought with them, and some who died bravely. And they did the remarkable thing of conquering the empire of Antiochus Epiphanes, resisting his rule over Judea. And even, as we're told here, putting foreign armies to flight. They were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. If you read Maccabees, or 2 Maccabees in particular, there's blood and horror and gore and faith, and very remarkable as a story it is. Still, part of the outcome of faith for the prophets and the Old Testament history, it moves on to a second idea, second section, particularly moving towards the idea of resurrection and new life. Verse 35, women received their dead by resurrection. Think of the bringing back to life of 2 young boys, one through Elijah, one through Elisha. If you know those stories in 1 Kings and in 2 Kings, 1 Kings 17, 2 Kings 4, thereabouts. Elijah and Elisha each, by faith, seeing God bring someone back from the dead, each time a boy. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. We've got a number of those in the Old Testament. Prophets are put to death by stoning or by the sword. Other stories from ancient Israelite tradition that aren't actually in the Old Testament, but were accepted as the history of the people in these days, and they would have known these famous stories from history. They refused to accept release, freedom from their torture, in order to obtain a better resurrection. What's better than a resurrection? Well, the 2 boys who were raised from the dead during the time of Elijah and Elisha, or a few people who Jesus or the apostles raised from the dead in the Gospels and in Acts, of course, they went on to die again later. This better resurrection is what you can't see. It's where faith lies. It's Lazarus's sister saying, I know he will rise again at the resurrection of the dead. Now, Lazarus did rise again for a bit before then, but at the resurrection is the real key. That's the better resurrection. It's the eternal resurrection, not the silly non-Christian idea of the immortality of the soul. We carry on living after we die. We don't, we're dead. But God raises from the dead. That's the great truth of 1 Corinthians and of Jesus' teaching, and here in Hebrews. There is a resurrection if someone is brought back from the dead, but there's a better resurrection that we see by faith, not by sight, of a new life with a resurrection body, a new life completely in a new and better world. Better, better, better. Such a theme of Hebrews. Jesus, the better communicator than the angels. Jesus, the better everything, culminating the better high priest, the better sacrifice. And now there'll even be a better resurrection than a raising from the dead. Astonishing. Verse 36, others suffered mocking and flogging and chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death, sawn in two, killed by the sword. All these stories are there. You've got examples of them in the Old Testament or in Maccabees, a remarkable, dreadful story in Maccabees of a mother whose 7 adult sons, one after another, were put to death by the monsters of Antiochus Epiphanes and his armies. These 7 young men all sawn in two, one after the other. And as the seventh is about to die, the mother is told, tell him to turn and eat pig meat, which is what they were refusing to do because of their commitment to the law of Moses. Tell him to eat pig meat, and he and you will be saved. And his mother said to him, Son, accept death. It's better. And then I'll have all my 7 sons with me at the resurrection. That's faith. That a remarkable story, not in the Bible, but in the history of Israel between the Old Testament and the New. And you can read it if you have an Apocrypha in 2 Maccabees. Painful, powerful stories, but the author of Hebrews knows these stories and he's wanting to remind people these were folk who believed in God's promises and thought that obeying God was better than anything in this world because they had faith in what wasn't yet seen, but they knew to be wonderful and beyond wonderful. There's a story too of in the Jewish histories, though not in the Bible, of Isaiah, that great prophet. We don't know it from the Bible what happened to him, but the story is, and it was told in Israel in those days, that he was put to death by Manasseh, who's probably just about the most evil and monstrous and worse of all the kings who followed on after great David and great Solomon. Manasseh had children sacrificed and all sorts of things. And the story is that he had Isaiah sawn in two. We don't know. It's one of the stories. It's part of what the Israelites had as their history, their culture. And so being sawn in two could refer to some of the awful things in Maccabees. It could refer to the story of Isaiah. But these were stories that the Israelites held of how their forebears had been cruelly, monstrously treated, but they'd clung to God and to their belief that there was something better for them. That's faith. At the end of verse 37, they went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. A lot of this is very much the story of the awful, awful persecution in the time of Antiochus, 160-ish BC. The terrible killings and tortures. And it's said that over a 3-day period of bloodthirst and gore from Antiochus, 40,000 Jewish folk were killed and another 40,000 taken and sold into slavery. And utter dreadful persecution. And what would we say, that they were sad cases or that the world conquered them? Hebrews says the world wasn't worthy of them. They were the ones who were the real victors. They were the conquerors because their faith enabled them to die rather than deny their Lord. And their faith was in God's promise, in a future that they couldn't see, that they knew to be bigger and better and more glorious than anything in this world. This is powerful stuff. But there's something even more mind-blowing about to hit in the last two verses. All these, though they were commended for their faith, yeah, you bet they were, didn't receive what was promised, since God had provided something better so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. Now, if you or I were writing the story, we'd want to bring Christ in somehow, Christ's death. Of course, Hebrews has brought Christ's death in big time right through. And even Moses is told to have had faith in Christ in some way, in the promises of God. That's in verse 26. But here it isn't Christ who's the center of the blessing that these martyred, persecuted folk were looking for, or the city that Abraham was looking for, or the hope and the future that Moses was looking for. Of course, it's focused on Christ, and we'll get that next chapter and the final chapter. But here it's focused on us. That is the church. That is the people of God. You might want to say the bride of Christ or Christ's creation made perfect, but it's focused on us. It's focused on the church, with us, through us, in fellowship with us. They would be made perfect. And we will find, to our astonishment or otherwise, when we are made perfect, when our faith is realized and what we believed is seen to be far better than we could have imagined or believed, part of that will be not that we're just in fellowship with other Christian believers in the city of God, but that we're in fellowship with Abraham and with Moses and with those men who were sworn in too, rather than giving up their loyalty to their Lord, and that we will be together with them, and together with them we will be made perfect, and they will be made perfect together with us. This is about God's plan for his people being brought together and united in his city when faith is made visible and all things are seen, and we don't, as Paul would say, see in a glass darkly anymore, but see clearly what God has done. Amen.